Counter-Narrative News with a special episode on Roy Sawh, a pioneering radical grassroots black power advocate and leader in England from the 1960s. He's of Indian heritage from Guyana, born on the 11th of January 1934 to a very poor working class family there. He arrives in London in March 1958, in which he, like many others from the former British colonies, or the actual colonies, because not every British colony was independent by this time, was shocked to receive the type of white supremacy racism in Britain, having been educated in a colonial education about the quote-unquote mother country being a land of milk and honey and harmony and privilege and wealth, etc. Many people were absolutely knocked over and made to feel just off balance by the degree and the depth, the intensity of the racism that they faced. And so we're going to explore the life of Roy Sawh, who passed away just a couple of days ago. Really, really interesting and highly significant political figure in the modern history of Britain, and especially when it comes to the global anti-colonial struggle and the struggle against capitalism and colonialism, white supremacy, and for socialism. We're going to share a couple of clips and also read a couple of extracts about Roy Sawh, who was a close comrade of Michael de Freitas, otherwise known as Michael X. They both formed the Racial Action Adjustment Society, called RAS, which is also has another meaning as well in the Caribbean. It's very funny hearing very posh BBC interviewers interview de Freitas / Michael X about RAS. Anyway, that aside, Michael de Freitas as well, he's a very controversial figure. He's significant in popularizing actually and black power politics and helping to create confidence at the grassroots of African, Caribbean and Asian working class heritage grassroots, especially young people here in this particular time. First of all, we're going to share a clip of Roy Sawh being interviewed recently by Ansel Wong, who's another significant activist from Guyanese heritage. They're talking about when Roy Sawh was arrested actually and charged and found guilty under the recently established 1968 Race Relations Act. Roy Sawh was one of the first to be prosecuted under this new law. Anyway, to the quote with Ansel Wong and the clip.
The iconic fact that you were one of the first person to be arrested under this new 1968 Race Relations Act, and you got a £120 fine for that. So-called incitement. What was it like to be able to constantly be fearful of arrest or fearful of attack?
No, I wasn't afraid because I assumed that speaking in Hyde Park, because they said it was a free place, you can go and stand up and say whatever you want. I didn't believe that people could be charged. And when I was charged for inciting racial violence, all I said was, somebody asked me, if you were in South Africa, how would you solve the problem? And I said, oh, very easy. They said, what do you mean? I said, every white family in South Africa has a black cook, 2 ounces of rat poison, and you can solve the problem overnight.
Yes, yeah. And what I think for me, the lesson is, interestingly, in terms of a postscript to that event, was the Commander Newman, who was the arresting officer at the time. It was he, Commander Newman, that was actively engaged in trying to ban the carnival and trying to say the carnival should not happen in that way. So he has a history, he has a record.
Sometimes it's difficult to read someone's reaction, but it's quite funny. You have Roy Sawh being interviewed there by Ansel Wong. Roy Sawh, I mean, he's such a witty, funny guy. He's all about the radical, witty flourish of militancy. And then there's Ansel Wong, kind of, it comes across like he doesn't know how quite to react to Roy Sawh saying, well, his response to the answer or the problem of apartheid was that every white settler in South Africa has a black cook. so the black cook can just administer some rat poison, you resolve the problem. Poor Roy Sawh got arrested and charged, and I think he spent a couple of weeks in prison over that as well, and he got a fine of around £120 there back in the late 60s. Now there's another interesting clip. In the same online conference, Ansel Wong asks Roy Sawh, of all the interesting personalities he's met throughout his whole life, who does he consider to be the most important of all the people he's met? And then Roy Sawh answers Stokely Carmichael, who later changed his name to Kwame Ture. So to the clip and then a few more comments.
In your time and your years, you have interacted or you have met a number of very important people, activists, celebrities, and so on. I'm thinking of people like Stokely Carmichael, Muhammad Ali, Lord Scarman, Michael X, and of course Jenny. Who were the ones that you had the greatest respect and contribution to your development as an activist? The person.
Oh, the one I admire was Stokely Carmichael.
Yes,
because he was born in Trinidad, grew up in the States, and coming from a Caribbean background, he was in a position to articulate the black situation in America so we can understand it in over here. Because over here we didn't understand what was going on in America, because we thought America was free and would take care of the black people and would take care of all the minorities. But then as we grew up and as we went along, we realized that America was as bad as the rest of the world.
So it's not surprising that Roy Sawh would say that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, was the most significant person that he has met and associated with throughout his entire political life. Because if you see, it's in the context here of the mid-60s, at a time where really the revolutionary socialist slogan of Black Power has a very important impact and influence in developing the self-confidence of the radical grassroots here in England as well, in terms of moving away from the colonially imposed inferiority complexes born out of white supremacy. Now, there's an interesting pamphlet by the Race Today collective, which was led by Darcus Howe, who's now with the Ancestors. It's called The Struggle of Asian Workers in Britain, and it's published in 1983. So the Race Today collective was a radical Black Power movement of mainly Caribbean and Indian heritage activists, and Roy Sawh is mentioned in this along with RAS, the Racial Adjustment Action Society, and Michael X. It's around the industrial dispute of Asian workers at the Red Scar plant, in which in late 1964 going to 1965 they went on a what's called a wildcat strike that it didn't have the support of the official trade union, which was the Transport General Workers Union. So they went on a spontaneous self-organized strike in 1965 against and in protest of being this new work regulations being imposed, which basically would increase the work effort by 50% with only a 3% wage increase. So in relation to this, the pamphlet mentions this, and it says, quote, "At Red Scar, again for the first time in Asian struggle, the black movement made a much publicized intervention in the persons of Mr. Roy Sawh and Mr. Michael de Freitas, sometimes known as Michael X. They came from the Racial Adjustment Action Society, RAS. Their intervention took the form at first of a generalized demand from Mr. Sawh for a separate union for blacks. De Freitas later told the press that though he was against white people, he was not for separate unions. The workers listened to both these gentlemen, applauded their spirit and laughed at their anti-white jokes, but couldn't take them or their organization as serious channels of industrial struggle. It was apparent to the workers from the beginning that Michael X would bring them publicity in the quality Sunday papers, but no more. RAS had no experience with mobilizing an independent black revolutionary force in Britain and didn't seem to the workers as capable of analysing the issue of the strike, let alone mobilizing national or international support for it." End of quote. This is interesting. Obviously, there's a criticism as well, the criticisms, one should say, in what this Race Today collective pamphlet, The Struggle of Asian Workers in Britain, is saying about Roy Sawh and RASP. However, it's also stating positively that for the first time in Asian industrial struggle, the Black Power politics makes this intervention. And this is in 1965. So this is still relatively at the earlier stage of Black liberation socialist struggle in England. So it's still highly significant there. Now we're going to come to a quote from Sivanandan, and this quote from Sivanandan actually also mentions the Red Scar issue and the intervention by Roy Sawh and Michael de Freitas in that, because it is a significant development. Now, this is taken from an article from Sivanandan, who was associated, again, Sivanandans with the ancestors. It's taken from his article called From Resistance to Rebellion, Asian and Afro-Caribbean Struggles in Britain. So this quote from this kind of, again, it elaborates on the contribution of Roy Sawh to the race-class struggle in Britain. So, to quote, on 25th of June 1940, Udham Singh was hanged at a meeting of the Royal Asiatic Society and the East Indian Association at Caxton Hall, London. He had shot dead Sir Michael O'Dwyer, who, as Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab, had presided over the massacre of unarmed peasants and workers at Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar in 1919. Udham was a skilled electrician, an active trade unionist, and a delegate to the local trades council, and in 1938 had initiated the setting up of the first Indian Workers' Association in Coventry. In October 1945, at Chorlton Town Hall in Manchester, the 5th Pan-African Congress, breaking with its earlier reformism, pledged itself to the fight for the absolute and complete independence of the colonies and an end to imperialism, if need be through Gandhian methods of passive resistance. Among the delegates then resident in Britain were Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, Wallace Johnson, C.L.R. James, and Ras Makonnen. W.E. Du Bois, who had founded the Pan-African Congress in America in 1919, presided. In September 1975, 3 young West Indians held up a Knightsbridge restaurant for the money that would help set up proper schools for the black community, finance black political groups, and assist the liberation struggles in Africa. Of such strands have black struggles in Britain been woven, but their pattern was set on the loom of British racism. Just pausing a quote. So it's really framing two kind of historical moments. Shahid Udham Singh's action, direct action against the British colonialists responsible for the Amritsar massacre. So that was done in 25th of June 1940. General O'Dwyer sees his ultimate punishment for that. And then also to 1975 in September, when young revolutionaries hold up a Knightsbridge restaurant to finance liberation struggle. So in between that, there's some detail in this, and we're going to continue on with this quote. So to continue the quote, the African Caribbean struggles of this period, post-1962, also reflected a similar community-based, though different in origins. Ghana becomes free in 1957, Uganda in 62, and Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago in the same year. But there were other black colonies in Africa and the Caribbean still to be liberated. And then there was the black colony in North America, which beginning with Martin Luther King's civil rights movement was revving up to black power struggles of the mid-1960s. King visited London on the way to receiving his Nobel Prize in Oslo in December 1964, and at his instigation, a British civil rights organisation, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, CARD, was formed in February 1965, federating various Asian and Afro-Caribbean organisations and sporting Labour Party radicals. More significant, however, was the visit of Malcolm X. Malcolm blitzed London in February 1965, and in his wake was formed a much more militant organisation, the Racial Action Adjustment Society, RAS, with Michael de Freitas, later Abdul Malik, and later still Michael X as its head. Black men unite, it called. We have nothing to lose but our fears. It is the fashion today, even amongst blacks, to see Michael X only as a criminal who deserved to be hanged for murder by the Trinidadian government in 1975. The line between politics and crime, after all, is a thin one in a capitalist society, but it was Michael and Roy Sawh, a Guyanese Indian, and their colleagues in RAS who, as we shall see, more than anybody else in this period, freed ordinary black people from fear and taught them to stand up for their rights and their dignity. It was out of RAS too that a number of our present-day militants have emerged. It is also alleged in hindsight and contempt that RAS had no politics but the politics of thuggery. But it was RAS who descended on Red Scar Mills in Preston to help the Asian strikers at their invitation. And the point is telling, if only because it marked a progression in the organic unity of the Afro-Asian, Coolie and Afro-Caribbean slave struggles in the diaspora begun in Britain by Claudia Jones, West Indian Gazette, and Afro-Asian Caribbean News, on which Abhimanyu Manchanda, an Indian political activist and a key figure in the British anti-war movement, was to work. But RAS, or black militancy in general, would not have had the backing it did but for the growing disillusion with the Labour Party's policies on immigration control and therefore racism. The coloured immigrant still had hopes in the party of the working class and of colonial independence and sought to influence its policies. But after the 1964 general election, Labour's position became clearer. Peter Griffiths, the Tory candidate for Smethwick, an immigrant area in Birmingham, had campaigned on the basis of ending immigration and repatriating the coloureds. If you want to end for a neighbour, vote Liberal or Labour, he had sloganised, and won. But Labour won the election, and Harold Wilson, the incoming Prime Minister, denounced Griffiths as a parliamentary leper. However, Wilson's policies were soon to become leprous too. The Immigration Act was not only renewed in the White Paper of August 1965, but went on to restrict coloured immigration further on the basis that fewer members made for better race relations. In pursuit of that philosophy, Labour then proceeded to pass a Race Relations Act, September 1965, which threatened racial discrimination in places of public resort with conciliation. It was prepared, however, to penalise incitement to racial hatred and promptly proceeded to prosecute Michael X, pause quote, and also Roy Sawh, as we have seen. To continue the quote, racial attacks had already begun to mount in 1965 in the months preceding the White Paper, but after Griffith's victory, a Jamaican was shot and killed in Islington. A West Indian schoolboy in Notting Hill was nearly killed by white teenagers armed with iron bars, axes and bottles. A group of black men outside a cafe in Notting Hill received blasts from a shotgun fired from a moving car. Hate leaflets appeared in Newcastle upon Tyne. Crosses were burnt outside coloured citizens' homes in Leamington Spa, Rugby, Coventry, Ilford, Plaistow and Cricklewood. And a written warning, allegedly from the deputy wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, was sent to the Indian Secretary of Card. You will be burnt alive if you do not leave England by August the 31st. The British fascists, however, denied any connection with the Klan, not, it would appear, on a basis of fact, but in the conviction that there was now a sufficient groundswell of grassroots racism to float an electoral party. Electoral politics, of course, were not going to bring them parliamentary power, but they would provide a vehicle for propaganda and a venue for recruitment, and all within the law. They could push their vile cause to the limits of the law within the framework of the law, forcing the law itself to become more oppressive of democratic freedoms. By invoking their democratic right to freedom of speech, of association, etc., by claiming equal TV time as the other electoral parties, and by gaining legitimate access to the press and radio, they would propagate the cause of denying others those freedoms and legitimacies, the blacks in the first place. They would move the whole debate on race to the right and force incoming governments to further racist legislation on pain of electoral defeat. And so in 1967, the League of Empire Loyalists, the British National Party and local groups of the Racial Preservation Society merged to form the National Front, and in April that year put up candidates for the Greater London Council elections. Pause quote. This is a really important point Shivanandan is making, actually, and if we look to what happened then in the mid to the late 90s, the NF basically, as the non-government street far-right force, merges into the British Nationalist Party, and the leader of the National Front, Nick Griffin, becomes leader of the BNP. The BNP has a lot, and the BNP NF community does a lot of street provocations through the 70s, into the 80s and into the early 90s, but basically because of the strength of black resistance and also other white anti-fascists, most notably in anti-fascist action and other formations, they get beaten off the streets more or less, and then they enter into electoral politics proper by the late 90s, totally outflanking and out-strategizing the radical left, who don't basically in the white left, they don't address racism. They kind of internalize it constantly, and also have no understanding of mass work and grassroots politics. Anyway, to continue the quote. But they and the government reckoned without the blacks. The time was long gone when black people with an eye to returning home would put up with the repression. They were settlers now. And state racism had pushed them into higher and more militant forms of resistance, incorporating the resistance of the previous period and embracing both shop floor and community. Asians and Afro-Caribbeans, sometimes in different areas of struggle, sometimes together. RAS, as we have seen, was formed in 1965. It was wholly an indigenous movement arising out of the opposition to native British racism, but catalyzed by Malcolm X and the black Muslims. And so it took in on both counts the African, Asian, Afro-Caribbean and Afro-American dimensions of struggle and the struggles in the workplace and community. It had, almost as its first act, descended on the Red Scar Mill in Preston to help the Asian strikers. It then set up office in a barber shop in Reading and worked and recruited in the North and the Midlands with Abdullah Patel, one of the strikers from the Red Scar Mills, and Roy Sawh as its organizer there. In London too, RAS gathered a sizable following through its work with the London busman and its legal service. Defence for black people in trouble with the police. It was written up in the press, often as a novel and passing phenomenon, and appeared in a bad light on BBC's Panorama programme. The disillusion with cards swelled RAS's numbers, and the indictment of Michael X in 1967 for an inflammatory speech against white people, when white people indulge freely in racist abuse, served to validate RAS's rhetoric. At Speaker's Corner, Roy Sawh and other black speakers would inveigh against the white devil and the Anglo-Saxon swine, and find a ready and appreciative audience. In June 1967, the Universal Coloured People's Association was formed, headed by a Nigerian playwright, Obi Egbuna. Pause quote. Also, Roy Sawh is fundamental and a co-founder of the UCPA as well. Continue quote. It too arose from British conditions, but continuing the tradition of the struggle against British colonialism, stressed the need to fight both imperialism and racism. The anti-white struggle was also anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, universal to all coloured peoples. And so its concern extended from racism in Britain and elsewhere to the war in Vietnam, the independence of Zimbabwe, the liberation of Portuguese Africa, the Cultural Revolution in China. It was, of course, inspired and influenced by the Black Power struggle in America, and more immediately by Stokely Carmichael's visit to London in July that year. Black Power, Egbuna declared at a Vietnam protest rally in Trafalgar Square in October 1967, means simply that the blacks of this world are out to liquidate capitalist oppression of black people wherever it exists by any means necessary. Black people in Britain, the UCPA pointed out, though numerically small, were so concentrated in vital areas of industry, hospital service, a majority of doctors and nurses in the conurbations were black, and transport, that a black strike could paralyse the economy. Some UCPA speakers at meetings in Hyde Park urged more direct action. Roy Sawh, the members of one organisation were often members of another. Roy Sawh urged coloured nurses to give wrong injections to patients, coloured bus crews not to take the fares of black people, and Indian restaurant owners to put something in the curry. Pause quote. When Roy Sawh said these things, he said it as a form of black power militancy and advocacy and agitation, but he also did it in a witty, comedic way to kind of make witty points in an insightful and sharp manner, and it often received great applause and laughter from the crowd. Continue the quote. Alex Watson, a Jamaican machine operator, was reported to have exhorted coloured people to destroy the whites. Ajoy Ghosh, an unemployed Indian, pointed out that to kill whites was not murder, and Ayonumu Ezekiel, Nigerian electrician, having derided the Prime Minister as a political prostitute, said England was going down the toilet. They were all prosecuted. Ezekiel was discharged, the others fined. But UCPA rhetoric was helping to stiffen black backs, its meetings and study groups to raise black consciousness, its ideology to politicize black people. The prosecution of its members showed up the complicity of the courts, protection rackets for the police. The secretary of the West Indian Student Centre was to call them. And its example, like that of RAS, encouraged other black organizations to greater militancy. RAS, it would appear, stressed black nationalism, while the UCPA emphasized the struggles of the international working class. But they were in fact different approaches to the same goals. RAS's nationalism, stemming as it did from the West Indian experience, combined an understanding of how colonialism had divided the Asian and African and Caribbean peoples, coolie, savage, and slave, with an awareness of how that same colonialism made them one people now. They were all blacks, hence the Black House and the cultural groups that RAS was briefly set up in 1970 did not, like Leroy Jones' Amri Baraka's Spirit House, with which was its inspiration, exclude other colours. The historical experience was different. What Powell says today, the Tories say tomorrow, and Labour legislates on the day after. Pause quote. Enoch Powell, notorious racist politician from the Tory party, basically advocated mass repatriation, forced expulsion of black migrants to Britain, made the famous Rivers of Blood speech, basically, all this kind of alarmist, racist stuff that I think the paraphrasing or close to the direct quote is, he said that one day the black man will have the whip hand over the white man in England, and then they will run rivers of blood. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so to continue. What Powell says today, the Tories say tomorrow, and Labour legislates on the day after. Immediately, it was public opinion that was roused. The press picked up Powell's themes and Powell. The unspeakable had been spoken. Free speech set free, the whites liberated, Asians and West Indians were abused and attacked, their property damaged, their women and children terrorised. Police harassment increased, the fascists went on a rampage, and Paki bashing emerged as the national sport. A few trade unionists made gestures of protest and earned the opprobrium of the rank and file. White workers all over the country downed tools and staged demonstrations on behalf of Powell. And on the day that even-handed Labour, having passed a generally racist Immigration Act, was debating a phony anti-racist race relations bill, London dockers struck work and marched on Parliament to demand an end to immigration. 3 days later they marched again, this time with the Smithfield meat porters. But the blacks were on the march too. On the same day as the dockers and porters marched, representatives of over 50 organisations, including the Indian Workers Association, West Indian Student Centre, NFPA, UCPA, RAS, etc., came together at Leamington Spa to form a national body, the Black People's Alliance, a militant front for black consciousness against racialism. And in that, the Black People's Alliance was uncompromising from the outset. It excluded from membership immigrant organisations that had compromised with the government policy or fallen prey to government handouts. Labour's urban aid programme was beginning to percolate through to the blacks, or look to the Labour Party for redress. For in respect of whipping up racial antagonisms and hatred to make political gains, there was no difference between the parties or between them and Enoch Powell. He was just one step in a continuous campaign which had served to give the green light to the overtly fascist organisations now very active in organising amongst the working class. Member organisations would continue to maintain their independent existence and function at the local level in terms of the particular communities and problems. The BPA would operate on the national level, coordinating the various fights against state racism. And when necessary, it would take to the street en masse, as it did in January 1969 during the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference, when it led a march of over 7,000 people to Downing Street to demand the repeal of the Immigration Acts. From Powell's speech and BPA, but nurtured in the Black Power movement, sprang a host of militant black organisations all over the country, with their own newspapers and journals taking up local, national and international causes. Just pause there for a second. I think Shivanandan does mention this elsewhere, but the Black People's Alliance is basically, the force of it and the leadership of it is led by the radical Maoist Indian Punjabi leader of the Indian Workers Association in Great Britain and the editor of Lalkar up to around 1979, Jagmohan Joshi, based in Birmingham. It was his following that comprised most of the human capacity of the Black People's Alliance. So just to kind of put that in there. And to continue the quote. From Power Speech and BPA, but nurtured in the Black Power movement, sprang a host of militant black organizations all over the country with their own newspapers and journals taking up national, local, international issues. Some Jamaican organizations marched on their High Commission in London, protesting the banning the works of Stokely and Malcolm X in Jamaica, while others, like WISC, RAS and the Caribbean Artist Movement, sent petitions. On the banning of Walter Rodney from returning to his post at the university, Jamaican staged a sit-in at the High Commission. A third world benefit for 3 imprisoned playwrights, Wallace Siyinka in Nigeria, Leroy Janes in America, and Obi Egbuna in Britain, was held at the Roundhouse with Sammy Davis, Black Eagles, and Michael X. But Egbuna's imprisonment with 2 other UPCA members for uttering and writing threats to kill police also stirred up black anger. Unless something is done to ensure the protection of our people, wrote the Black Panther movement in its circular of 3rd of October 1968, we will have no alternative but to rise to their defense. And once we are driven to that position, redress will be too late. Detroit and New York will inevitably be part of the British scene, and the Thames foam with blood sooner than Enoch Powell envisaged. More fire. To continue the quote, the African Caribbean community, for its part, excepting the workplace, which will be treated separately, was occupied with fighting the miseducation of its children and the harassment of the police. Both problems had existed before, but they had now gathered momentum. West Indian children were consistently and right through the schooling system treated as uneducable and as having unrealistic aspirations together with a low IQ. Consequently, they were banded into classes for backward children or dumped in ESN, educationally subnormal schools, and forgotten. Just pause quote. Banding is continuing in primary schools from year 1 onwards. Every single classroom. It's there. Lower, middle, and upper. It's absolutely there. It's classist, it's racist, it's horrific, it causes mental health problems, insecurity, lack of confidence, etc. Also, educationally subnormal, ESN, still lives on in a slightly different rhetoric called SEN, Special Education Needs, an horrific regime of brutality and racism and classism absolutely embedded in our education system. It's a really scandalous situation that's seeing very little pushback and campaigning. To continue the quote, the fight against categorization of their children as underachieving and therefore fit only to be an underclass began in Haringey, London in the 1960s by West Indian parents, teachers and North London West Indian Association, NLWIA, under Jeff Crawford, now spread to other areas and became incorporated in the programs of black political organizations. An appeal to the Race Relations Board 1970 elicited the response that the placement of West Indian children in ESN schools was no unlawful act. The Caribbean Education Association then held a conference on the subject, and in the following year, Bernard Cord, now Deputy Prime Minister of Grenada, wrote his influential work, How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal. Black militants and organizations, meanwhile, had begun to set up supplementary schools in larger conurbations. Just pause quote. Bernard Cord, very significant figure in the development of the grassroots, especially around discrimination and racism in the education system, as just been quoted. But also, as has been quoted, was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Grenada, who has a falling out with the other Grenadian revolutionary Maurice Bishop, in which Bernard Cord violently splits with Maurice Bishop ending up being shot dead with several other leadership comrades of Grenada. That's another crazy story and history that we will popularize as time goes on. Just wanted to put that in there. It's very, very important. To continue, in London alone there was the Kwame Nkrumah School, Hackney Black Teachers, the Malcolm X Montessori Program, Ajoy Ghosts, the George Padmore School, John LaRose and the Black Parents Movement, and the South East London Summer School, the Black Unity Freedom Party, Head Start, the Black Liberation Front, and Marcus Garvey School, the BLF and others. Projects were also set up to teach youths. Projects were also set up to teach skills to youths. The Mkutano project, for instance, started by the BUFP in 1972, taught typing, photography, Swahili. The Melting Pot, begun about the same time by Ashton Gibson, once of RAS, had a workshop for making clothes. And Kiskadee, set up by ex-CARD official Oscar Abrams, taught art and sculpture and encouraged black poets and playwrights. For older students, Roy Sawh ran the Free University for Black Studies. And then there were the hostels for unemployed and homeless black youth, such as Brother Herman's Harambe and Vince Hines Dashiki, both of whom had been active in RAS and clubs and youth centres. Finally, there were bookshop come advice centres such as the Black People's Information Centre, BLF's Grassroots Storefront, BWM's Unity Bookshop, and the weekly or monthly newspapers Black Voice of the BUFP, Grassroots of the BLF, Freedom News of the Black Panthers, Frontline of the Brixton and Croydon Collective, Uhuru of the BPFM, Black People's Freedom Movement, BPFM Weekly, the BWAC Weekly, that's the Black Workers Action Committee, and the less frequent but more theoretical journal Black Liberator, and a host of others that were more ephemeral. Some of these papers took up the question of black women, and the BUFP, following on the UCPA's Black Women's Liberation Movement, had a Black Women's Action Committee. RAS's Black House was going to be a huge complex encompassing several of these activities, but hardly had it got off the ground in February 1970 that it was raided by the police and closed down, and RAS itself began to break up. Members of RAS, however, went on to set up various self-help projects as indicated above. By 1971, the UCPA was also breaking up into its component groups, with the hardcore of them going to form the Black Unity Freedom Party. National bodies were by now not as relevant to the day-to-day struggles as local ones, and the former unifying role could equally be fulfilled by ad hoc alliances. The UCPA, RAS, the Black Panthers and other black organisations had in the previous 2 years been increasingly occupied with the problem of police brutality and fascist violence. The success of Black Power had brought down on its head the wrath of the system. Its leaders were persecuted, its meetings disrupted, its places of work destroyed. But it had gone on gaining momentum and strength. It was not a party but a movement gathering to its concerns all strands of capitalist oppression, gathering to its program all problems of oppressed peoples. There was hardly a black in the country that did not identify with it, and though to all the non-whites of the world, then one way or the other. And as for the British-born youth who had been schooled in white racism, the movement was the cradle of their consciousness. Vietnam, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, Azania, with all their battle lines, China and Cuba, their exemplars. The establishment was scared. The media voiced its fears. There were rumours that Black Power was about to take over Manchester City Council. In the summer of 1969, the UCPA and the Caribbean Workers' Movement were documenting and fighting the cases of people beaten up and framed by the police in Manchester and London. In August, the UCPA held a Black Power rally against organised police brutality on the streets of Brixton. In 1970, the UCPA and the Pakistani Progressive Party staged a protest outside the House of Commons over Paki bashing in the East End of London. And the Pakistani Workers' Union called for citizens' defence patrols. A number of Asians had been murdered in 1969 and 1970. A month later, over 2,000 Pakistanis, Indians and West Indians marched from Hyde Park to Downing Street demanding police protection from skinhead attacks. Pause. Can you imagine today? 2,000 Pakistanis, Indians and people from the Caribbean marching in unity and militancy on Downing Street. Can you see how far we've collapsed? It's just extraordinary. Continue quote. In the summer of 1970, police attacks on blacks, abuse, harassment, assaults, raids, arrests on Sawh, etc. in London, Manchester, Bristol, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, etc. put whole black communities under siege. Pause. Sawh it's an old, ancient law that they brought back to facilitate the police stopping and searching and harassing people under suspicion of having committed a crime. I mean, this still goes on today. How many times are we stop and search on road for fitting the description of someone who's been reported for a crime? Same old nonsense. To continue the quote. In July and August, there were a series of clashes between black youth and the police in London, and on one occasion, over 100 youth surrounded the Caledonian Road police station, demanding the release of 4 blacks who had been wrongfully arrested. Things finally came to a head in Notting Hill on 9th of August, when police broke up a demonstration against the proposed closure of the Mangrove restaurant with unprecedented violence. The blacks fought back, a number of them were arrested, and 9 of the ringleaders subsequently charged with riot, affray and assault. The Mangrove was a meeting place and an eating place, a social and welfare club, an advice and resource centre, a black house for black people, a resting place in Babylon. And if only for this reason, the police could not leave it alone. They raided it, harassed its customers, and relentlessly persecuted its owner, Frank Critchlow. They made it the test of police power. The blacks made it a symbol of resistance. The battle of the blacks and the police would be fought over the Mangrove. The trial of the Mangrove 9, October to December 1971, is too well documented to be recounted here, but briefly, they won. They did more. They took on what the Defence Council called naked judicial tyranny, some by conducting their own defence, and won. Above all, they unfolded before the nation the corruption of the police force, the bias of the judicial system, the racism of the media, and the refusal of black people to submit themselves to the tyrannies of the state. Other trials would follow, and even more bizarre prosecutions would be brought, as when the alleged editor of Grassroots was charged with encouraging the murder of persons unknown by reprinting an article from the freely available American Black Panther paper on how to make Molotov cocktails. But they would all be defended by the whole community and became another school in political education, end of quote. So you can see how significant and pioneering Sawh war, rest in eternal militant peace, he was in terms of encouraging people to have confidence, militant confidence, to be fearless. And together with all these different comrades in the grassroots, look at the wonderful achievements that they made for us. But then, and we're going to share more things from Roy Sawh. There'll be more episodes, and there'll be series on Roy Sawh. We've got his pamphlet produced by Hansib Publishers. Big salutations and big up to Arif Ali of Hansib. And it's a book about him and by him, so we'll be sharing some things. But in this book and other places, Roy Sawh says that if the Black Power struggle is not escalated, what we're going to have is a return to vicious white supremacy and racism, the revenge of the white racists in place of government, and mass repatriation, forced, racist, violent repatriation of racialized migrant people to Britain. A lot of that has come to fruition. We have in the government a far-right, openly far-right government, Tory regime now in this country. We have the return of the feudal monarchist colonial culture of the monarchy. We have Brexit, which formalizes all of this. We don't have the mass repatriation physically, but we have its politics normalized and political center ground with the Rwanda policy, the weaponization of the small boats, etc., etc., etc. So we have descended the mountain when at the time of Roy Sawh and all of his comrades and all of these alliances and formations, we were actually traversing the summit. It's a lot to reflect on, and we will be sharing more going forward. Many thanks.